So Platypus is an organization that was founded in 2007. At first it was a reading group that wanted to understand some more about the history of Marxism. It was put together by undergraduates and graduates of the University of Chicago and the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. And it began during a very confusing period of the anti-war movement. So if you were around back then, you remember that there would be protests in the streets, people handing out pamphlets, but you come home with all these pamphlets and really don't know what sense to make of them other than you oppose the war. And so we thought, well, maybe we should start to have events in which we ask people about their positions. Why is it they hold those positions? Why do they think it's meaningful? What kind of purpose does it have on the present? And so our events are usually a collection of people that may not entirely agree with each other. We see these events as being educational, both for our own self-education as members and for our public. So this is part of the series that's more of a cultural theme, and we'll have more coming up, the Death of Art event, which all of you should have on your programs. There's a couple of events that are coming up. But most of the project is explicitly political. So I think that Sammy might talk a little bit about the relationship between politics and architecture that they're trying to investigate here. Apart from that, we have chapters from around the world. I think there's also a list in the program, and our strongest chapters are in Chicago as well as in New York. We have a chapter at Stony Brook, a chapter at NYU, and one at the New School. And if you're around those campuses, we welcome you to have a conversation with us. We have weekly coffee break meetings as well as a reading group that happens on the weekends. Apart from that, we hope that you enjoy the event and provide us with feedback, whether it be us personally. You can find anyone that's part of Platypus because they have a pin. So after the event, you can come up to us and give us feedback, or you can suggest future events, future conversations that you'd like to see in the city of New York or elsewhere. Okay, with that said, my name is Pam McGallis, and I am part of the NYU chapter of Platypus, and I welcome Sammy Medina, who's one of the organizers of this event. Thank you.
Hi. I'd like to thank everyone for coming out in such cool weather and pending simple. I'd like to thank the panelists as well for making the time to come out as well. And also to Professors Boris Royce, Jean-Luc Glenn, and not Professor Kelsey Campbell-Balligan, who designed the poster that's projected on the screen. To start, I'm Simon Medina. I've been working with Platypus for the last couple of months. I helped organize the panel with Ross Wolf, the moderator. And so I'm just going to go into to introduce the panelists at the moment, and then I'll talk a little bit about the panel after. To begin, we have Peter Eisenman, design principal of Eisenman Architects in New York, whose current projects include the City of Culture in Galicia, Spain. He's also produced a master plan for Policciolo, Italy, and also other Italian projects. He's well known for his winning design for the Memorial to the Murdered Jews of Europe in Berlin, and also for the Wexner Center for Visual Arts in Ohio. He's the author of many books, including Written into the Void, Selected Writings, 1990 through 2004, and 10 Canonical Buildings, 1950 through 2000, which everyone should know. He's also the Charles Gwathmey Professor in Practice at the Yale School of Architecture. Next we have Reinhold Martin, who's Associate Professor of Architecture in the Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation at Columbia University, where he heads the PhD program in architecture and the Temple Hoyne-Gould Center for the Study of American Architecture. His recent book is Utopia's Ghost, Architecture and Postmodernism. Again, it's published by Princeton University, Minnesota University Press. He's also the co-author of Multinational City Architectural Itineraries on NAPDAR, along with Kambari Baxi. Currently, he's working on 2 books: A History of the 19th Century, 19th Century American University as a Media Complex, and a Study of the Contemporary City at the Intersection of Aesthetics and Politics. Joan Ockman is Distinguished Senior Fellow at the University of Pennsylvania School of Design. Before this, she served as the director of the Temple Hoyne-Gould Center for the Study of American Architecture at Columbia University from 1994 to 2008. and was a member of the faculty of Columbia's Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation for over 2 decades. Her most recent book is Architecture School, 3 Centuries of Educating Architects in North America. A 20th anniversary edition of her book, Architectural Culture, 1943 to 1968, a documentary anthology, will appear in 2013. And that's also something that should be in everyone's library. Bernard Tschumi is widely recognized as one of today's foremost architects. In 1983, he won the prestigious competition for the Parc de la Villette. Since then, he has designed buildings such as the New York Office Museum, the Fenois National Studio for Contemporary Arts, the Richard E. Lindner Athletic Center at the University of Cincinnati, and architecture schools in La Vallée, France, and Miami, Florida. His many books include a 3-part event study series, also the Manhattan Transcripts, and Architecture in Disjunction. Tschumi was awarded Francis Grand Grand Prix National d'Architecture in 1996, as well as numerous awards from the American Institute of Architects and the National Endowment of the Arts. To begin, to offer some brief words on the panel. Tonight's theme, as you can see in the title, is revolutionary architecture. To preface this, and also the introduction, the discussion to follow, I'd like to reiterate the fact that Bach's primary focus is political and historical. Tonight's event, Revolutionary 20th Century Architecture and Its Failure, provides only a window into the political and historical issues that most preoccupy Bachos. As such, the possibility, or rather impossibility, of revolutionary architecture should be regarded as symptomatic of the possibility and impossibility of revolutionary politics today. From this, we could and will say that the putative death of architecture seems to be indicative of the death of the left and subsequent political regression of our age. In short, to repeat the well-known formulation, there can be no revolutionary architecture, or revolutionary culture for that matter, without revolution. This is not, of course, to deny architecture's peculiar and robust powers to provide a critique of Catholicity, among many other things. This has brought us to ask the following questions. Number 1, where does architecture stand at present in terms of its history? Number 2, were we ever postmodern? Number 3, what social and political tasks yet remain unfilled, carried over from the 20th century in a world scattered with the ruins of modernity? Number 4, does utopia's ghost, the specter of modernism, still haunt contemporary building? Number 5, how can architecture be responsibly practiced today? And lastly, but most important, is revolutionary architecture even possible? With that, I'll hand it off to our moderator, Ross, who is a recent graduate of the University of Chicago. He's the author of numerous articles and essays of Soviet architecture, Soviet history, and Marxist political theory. His forthcoming book, The Graveyard of Utopia, Soviet Urbanism and the Fate of the International Avant-Garde, is scheduled for release in spring 2013 from Zero Books. Ross?
Okay. Then. Sorry. Okay. Just to go over the format of the events, the panelists are going to give their introductory remarks between 12 and 15 minutes. Following that, there's going to be a brief discussion, responses between the panelists to each other's presentations, and after that, we'll open it up to audience Q&A. So with that, beginning alphabetically, I'd like to turn it over to Peter Eisenman.
Thanks very much. I don't know if this is on.
Yeah.
Is it on?
It's on.
Can you hear me without?
Yeah, speak in it.
What?
Can you turn it up?
I mean, I'm fine, as long as I can hear. Then everybody in the back here? No. Well, architect. That's the trouble with modern buildings. It's all the way out. Well, they could come down and sit. Yeah, there's a lot of room here, and you'll be able to hear. It's much more comfortable in those chairs. Anyway, when Platypus asked me to be on this panel, it was only because of my fellow panelists that I agreed. I have a colleague at Yale that I call Platypus, and I thought maybe it was his society. In fact, my dean asked me today if it was his society, and I said I didn't really think so. But I strongly objected to the title, Ruins of Modernity, the failure of revolutionary architecture in the 20th century. At least I thought it would be a question. It seems to be a sentence, a declarative sentence. And so I sit here after my 80th birthday, sort of accused of the last 50 years of being a failure and in ruins, because I, for one, believe in modernism and modernity, and I've practiced in that way. And I would rather think that that's a problem. Now, revolutionary architecture, I don't know if there is revolutionary architecture. It's a word that is used. It could be avant-garde architecture. And if we look around the world at what's being built by what you would call not revolutionary architects, but architects that couldn't have done these things 20 years ago, you would say, hey, avant-garde architecture is alive and well. In fact, too alive and well as far as I'm concerned. I won't mention any of my colleagues' names, but you just have to pick up the daily blog on Architectural Record to see all of the avant-garde work that's being built, not in New York necessarily, but around the globe. So I would argue that the ruins of modernism may be the avant-garde architecture that's being built today. That's a possibility. And I wouldn't think it's any more ruins of modernism than certainly the ruins of postmodernism are probably more appropriate, or the ruins of historicism, or I don't know what you want to call today. I call it sort of a kind of Rococo modernism. But I don't see it as any more of a failure than any style or label. And in fact, I think it's existed for probably much longer than most avant-garde gestures have lasted. If my practice, which I would like to think still a modernist practice, has any meaning. So therefore, not to sound like the heavy, because I'm very happy to be with my friends. And I know Bernard still thinks he's a modernist, I believe, but I may be wrong. We've always paraded under that aegis, at least in the last 2 weeks at the Decon show at MoMA, which was an avant-garde show, at least in MoMA's terms. And we were both happy to be under that title at least 2 weeks ago. So I hope he's still here with me. We were given 6 questions to answer. I'm really not the right person to be on this panel because the questions, I don't know how to answer most of them. I'm going to answer some. The first question, where does architecture stand at present in terms of history? I'm not an historian. I practice architecture, and so Joan and Reinhold will have to, if Reinhold is an historian, I think he is. I know Joan is. Reinhold may be a theoretician, which I think is a difference. But so I don't know where architecture is in terms of history. Are we still, or were we ever postmodern? And my answer that I've written in red, who cares? If people here care, are we or not, then, they're interested in ping pong balls and haystacks. So I think it's a very interesting issue. What social and political tasks yet remain unfilled, carried over from the 20th century in a world scattered with the ruins of modernity? Well, I've already answered that question because I don't know about the ruins of modernity. And the next question is Reinhold, since he wrote a book on Utopia's ghost, and I've never believed in utopia or the utopian promise of modernism or any such thing. So I think, Reinhold can answer that. Now, to go to the third question, how can architecture be responsibly practiced today? I have two surrogates who I'm going to read a few sentences from, who much more belong on this panel than I do, and I'm not going to answer this revolutionary architecture impossible. The two surrogates are, one is Jörg Gleider, who is the new professor of history and theory at the TU in Berlin, and he writes in an essay in a new book out that architecture achieves its status not by virtue of its technical performance, but by virtue of the dreamlike, irrational, and illusionary aspects of what once was a seemingly objective and functional artifact. The task of architecture is to bring this up into consciousness, and it is to do so critically, insofar as architecture insists on the social promise once symbolized in the object that was technically and functionally advanced, that is, modernism. So I believe that Professor Gleider believes that, in fact, there is a role for architecture today, responsible, and that modernism is part of it. The other gentleman, and I'll read a couple of sentences from the text, is Pier Vittorio Redi, who is, in fact, an architect who teaches at the AA and at Yale, and an avowed neo-Marxist, since that is the political umbrella which we're under, and I certainly couldn't qualify in any way, shape, or form to be even holding the stick. He says, while in the 1990s avant-garde architects are on the decline of political correctness, we witness a new wave of socially concerned architecture. Paradoxically, while the economic recession is forcing many people to live in very precarious conditions, many of these young, socially concerned architects see the crisis as an opportunity for their creativity. This kind of creativity is precisely what capitalism has seized on as its main labor power. From industrial to post-industrial production, the infinite resourcefulness of the creative subject is precisely the fundamental labor subjectivity exploited by practice. And then he says, the new socially oriented architectural activism poses for us a dilemma which cannot be avoided. Are these new practices addressing the possibility of radical change, or are they simply confirming and to a certain extent sublimating the crisis' most regressive effects? And then a final quote that I would like to place in ledger. Said, once the working class would no longer represent a threat, like has happened in the last 40 years of a neoliberal economy, capital would dismiss its social democratic tendency. Ironically, the rise of activism and participation is complementary to the dismissal of a top-down welfare state. The self-help ad hoc approach promoted by architects, activists, is perfectly complementary to the idea in which citizens are no longer granted the basic infrastructure for living. Aestheticizing self-help conditions is a goal that increasingly precarious life becomes something as normal, even creative. As you can tell from what I read, I'm not much in favor of self-help activism. I believe that many of the things that we judge architecture by today, in other words, to get more from less, we produce a very strange situation. And I'm not interested very much in the activist role that is taken by people, environmentalists lead certificates, sustainability, and other things which ignite capital today. I still believe in the architect as a hero figure. I still believe in heroic architecture. I still believe that society has always, despite economic recessions, has always gone up and down. But the history of architecture has always been written by heroic figures. And I believe that culture needs an heroic attitude toward its architecture, the icons that create the history of today. Thank you.
Can we check the other one? Yes? So, okay, now, Reinhold.
Can we hear it back? How would you know? Yeah, well, there's one in the summer nodding, summer shaking. I'll speak as loudly as I must consult my machine. Well, first of all, thank you to Platypus, Ross, and colleagues for setting us up in this way. It's a very interesting setup. I think we're all, I think as Peter said here, out of respect and you know, to continue a long-standing conversation in amongst this group, but also I know in amongst many of you here in the room. Okay, so 13 minutes, okay? You can tell me if I go over. As a way of thanking Ross and Platypus for organizing this much-needed discussion and also marking some common ground, I want to begin by citing a little piece of history that I suspect lies somewhere in the background of the questions that you have. If you go tomorrow, which you should, if it's not snowing, to the Museum of Modern Art, and indeed you must, and spend some time with the beautiful Inventing Abstraction show curated by Leah Dickerman, you'll see amongst other, as it were, quote-unquote, ruins of the Soviet avant-garde, a diminutive study by El Lissitzky, executed in gouache, ink, and pencil for a 1920 project commemorating the then recently assassinated Spartacist leader Rosa Luxemburg. I deliberately did not put this on the screen here, since you really must go to the show, but also because I wanted to stand as kind of placeholder for the great double bind of modernist aesthetics that I think is essentially organizing this kind of discussion. And particularly of that, the double bind that in which that elusive thing called abstraction crosses paths with that other elusive thing called revolution. So I'm going to be a bit more specific about modernism here and just allow abstraction to come into the foreground for us. Suffice it to say that that little drawing, which measures about 4 by 4 inches square, consists itself of a deep black square with razor-thin white edge, set within or floating above a red circle off-center and surrounded by a concentric array of supremacist shapes in red, white, black, and speckled gray, which at once appear to be attracted centripetally to the picture's decentered center and to spin off centripetally from it, while a larger pair of black and gray bars seem to slip under or behind it. Over or under the black square and red circle is written in half-obscured Cyrillic characters the name Rosa Luxemburg. Maybe you know what she is. Well, there's nothing the least bit original about me citing this little piece of modernist esoterica in this way. Most notably, the art historian T.J. Clark has offered a vividly dialectical reading that pits Lissitzky's ambivalent proto-propagandistic realism, captured in the half-obscure text in this case, against the more uncompromising abstraction of his mentor, Lissitzky's mentor, Kazimir Malevich. Clark, for whom modernism are antiquity, and I suspect might be at least one source for the ruins here, ultimately judges Malevich the more faithful of the pair to the unbearable contradictions of the already ruined revolution. Wherein Malevich's original unmarked black quadrilateral, 1915, unenlightened, so to speak, by writing, by text, by propaganda, manifests a kind of constitutive revolutionary darkness. So that's not reading. But tables turn. This is what history teaches us. Which is to say that our problem today may no longer quite be the realism versus abstraction problem faced by Lissitzky, Malevich, or their colleagues at Unovis, in Political, or in any of the other vanguard cultural political organizations of that heady time and place. Or is it simply that the revolutionary or reformist intentions of the European avant-garde ran tragically aground on the shores of the capitalist international? Or even more misleadingly, this old story that they were mysteriously co-opted by the very real reactionary athletes of the Museum of Modern Art and their corporate sponsors. The problem instead is to define the problem. I think that's really what we're doing here. Not accidentally, in the Futurist 010 exhibition in Petrograd, 1516, Malevich hung his black square, and in fact we know it's not a black square, it's quadrilateral, not actually a square, but he hung it in the place in the upper corner of the room, the place traditionally reserved for the religious icon in Russian peasant culture. Today, it's not difficult to see that this was not only an act of transgression, it was a premonition. For it's no secret that under neoliberal capital, abstraction itself has become iconic in a strictly religious sense. So, my answer to Ross's double question, are we still, I guess this is the question, were we ever postmodern? Is yes. This is why this is a meaningful question. The answer is yes, but only now. Only now because architecture has finally become truly abstract. Now this is important not because it gives fresh impetus to the never-ending style wars, but because it redefines our categories. So again, I'm not saying anything original in associating postmodernism with abstraction, counterintuitively for many people in architecture. Among others, Frederick Jameson has done so eloquently and at length. But you must understand that what one means here by abstraction is not fully captured by the usual distinction between abstract and figural art, for example, or by the endless, undecidable debates as to which approach is more or less revolutionary, whether in the political or the artistic sense. What I mean is something like a concrete abstraction, but with a slight difference from the common Marxian sense in which that kind of language is often used. If, for example, circulatory financial instruments like derivatives and the values they produce are abstract, the Bank of America as an institution, a set of buildings, and a group of people is concrete. The tables turn, however, when we recognize that that institution, those buildings, and those people are also, in some sense, constitutively abstract, in the sense of being interpolated as objects and as subjects in utterly tangible material ways into the language practices, imaginaries, and infrastructures of capital a priori. So in this light, it may seem, and perhaps rightly so, that the only truly revolutionary cultural activity, this is now much debated, is to be found in the real-world, hands-on, agitprop art actions in and around, for example, Occupy Wall Street, the ultra-globalization movement, the Arab Spring, and other insurgent formations worldwide. Architecture in its traditional or disciplinary forms is nowhere to be found in this mix, being so thoroughly hardwired to power precisely through its ability to deliver, on demand, an aestheticized abstraction, meaning the icon in all of its iterations, that complements and even reproduces the rush of religious fervor generated by and generating worldwide financialization. In the midst of all of this, there are plenty of revolutionary, or at least dissenting architects, many of whom are students, many of whom I suspect are in this room, and many of whom find the courage to speak out against injustice and dispossession on a daily basis and act accordingly. But there is no revolutionary architecture. Unless that is, an important caveat, unless that is, we are speaking of the sort of revolutions that begin from the right. There's lots of revolutionary architecture. From the other direction, let's say the left, even in its most insurgent grassroots variations, architecture is at best today to be found on the side of reform. Now, of course, Le Corbusier's now cliched question, architecture or revolution, suggests mutually exclusive categories. But that question's rhetorical nature also symptomatically represses the much more poignant and much more famous question posed by Rosa Luxemburg in 1900, reform or revolution. In Western Europe, by 1923, when Le Corbusier wrote, the enlightened reform of housing, of the city, and of Republican institutions of liberal capitalism was well underway, as represented, for example, in all of the projects, functionalist, formalist, and historicist, that were designed a few years later for the ill-fated League of Nations competition, including Le Corbusier's own. Luxembourg, Rosa Luxemburg, for whom Mies van der Rohe, you may know, also designed and built a memorial in 1926 that was demolished by the Nazis. Luxembourg had fought all her life against such compromise, which she regarded as opportunistic capitulations. But even in her polemical struggles in Germany with the reformist social democrats, whose, by the way, left-ward politics and policies we all know make today's American Democrats look like flaming neocons, her question, reform or revolution, names a double bind, a tangle tighter than a mere contradiction that can only be cut with the sharpest of knives, like a Dadaist collage. Here, architecture can be something much more than an art of the possible. For rather than merely, of course, that's the name for politics and that sort of thing, for rather than merely offering modest ways to make the brutal world system a little bit more humane, architecture harbors the capacity, precisely because of its simplicity, and not despite it, the capacity to conjure, like Liszewski's little drawing with its ghostly little letters, the spirit of Rosa Luxemburg. For every small reform, however earnest, however limited, potentially bears her revolutionary question within itself, and is well within architecture's resources to ask, loudly and defiantly, is that all you have to say? That's the question she asked the Social Democrat. Or to put it another way, is that the best you can do? This also means recognizing today how the tables have turned, and how the most insidious propaganda for things as they are, rather than things as they should be, is to be found in the most abstract, most ethereal, most otherworldly, and yes, most outwardly sophisticated architecture. As in the past, revolutions, actual or virtual, as in past revolutions, actual or virtual, architecture as a religious icon is therefore the first thing to be demolished, if the glimmers of other futures are to remain visible. For the so-called triumph of neo-modernist abstraction over historicist figuration is precisely what makes architecture finally and belatedly postmodern. So it's not that architecture was the sort of avatar of postmodernism. It comes, as it were, only now. At last, When the real estate developer demands world-class architecture above all else, architects have entered the bank vault, the headquarters of the New World Order, only to find nothing there. Except, that is, Malievich's black square hanging in the corner. Rather than celebrate this nothing or give it metaphysical gravitas, it's time to see it for what it is. Nor can one be satisfied with opposing a resistant or supposedly more real architecture of brick to the apparently weightless balloons of financialization. For inside the empty vault, or in the real estate bubble or balloon, the air is thick and thin. And from its material molecular density can be assembled concrete tools with which to gently tap or to firmly smash the idols of our day, just as Nietzsche applied his philosophical hammer to the pieties of idealist Apollonian classicism. What are these tools? Well, a precondition, I'm not going to answer that question. A precondition for that question, this is the point, is the desire to change things, really and genuinely. Of this, I'm afraid, there is little evidence in today's architecture, perhaps by definition. Instead, there are abundant, noble attempts to solve pragmatically the problems like climate change and poverty thrown up willy-nilly by the status quo, rather than a concerted effort to reject and reformulate the world system out of which these problems emanate. So too with abstraction, which was once the harbinger of other things, and now is the very emblem of complacency. Faced with this, one can only repeat with Rosa Luxemburg and with so many others, then and now. It does not have to remain this way.
Okay, I'm going to hand it over to Joan Ockman. She's got some. I think so. If you want to.
A non-practicing architect here, I'm the one showing pictures. So, and in fact, this is a picture argument. So, conjuring with ghosts, prompted by the questions from the organizers, and I also want to add my thanks to them for inviting me. I stumbled on Ross Wolf's marvelous blog a while ago and was just delighted with it. And so when a name behind the Charnel House appeared in my email, it was very exciting, and I was very pleased to agree, and also very delighted to be with my colleagues as well. Although I think we're all speaking slightly different languages here tonight, but we'll see. So, conjuring with ghosts, or geists, a dialectical fairy tale. When was modernity? History, one might say, is like a loaf of bread. Hypothetically, at least, it can be cut in many different places. In a singular modernity, Frederick Jameson offers up no fewer than 14 plausible starting points for the epoch we reflexively refer to as modern. But if, with Jameson, we agree that we cannot not periodize history, we also have to be clear that where we place the knife, which starting point, matters. If, for instance, we choose to ascribe the origins of modernity, is there an else? I can't remember. If we choose to ascribe the origins of modernity to the Industrial Revolution and its associated processes of development,
then we are privileging technology as the prime force driving history. On the other hand, if we choose the French or maybe even the American Revolution as a threshold moment, then we're assigning priority to the emergence of democratic values and enlightened thought. These respective narratives will, in turn, lead us to conclude that modernity has been either a colossal success or, at the very least, a partial failure. Critical histories of modern architecture have tended to vacillate between these narratives and their dialectic of instrumental and enlightened reason, with two figures in particular, these, that's what these spirited men, representing, as if mirror images of one another, diametric poles on the spectrum. Between Rainer Banham's Archaeology of the Future and Manfredo Capori's historical project, we may locate a good deal of the uncertainty that still haunts any attempt to theorize the present. In Theory and Design in the First Machine Age, Banham accused modern architects of not taking the new technology of their day seriously enough. Although they celebrated the machine age in their iconic imagery, the architects of the 20s failed to, quote, acquaint themselves with it very closely. In A Concrete Atlantis, he elaborates, quote, the form of factories and grain elevators were an available iconography, a language of forms, whereby promises could be made, adherence to the modernist credo could be asserted, and the way pointed to some kind of technological utopia, unquote. If by the mid-20th century, and in the wake of the terrifying destruction brought by military technology in World War II, glimpses of this future could appear more dystopian than utopian, Banham, himself trained initially as a mechanical engineer, never abandoned his hopes in technology's liberative potential. And today, some might say, his vision is being revindicated. A quarter century after Banham's death, contemporary architects, fully on board with the current digital and environmental revolutions, are eager to collaborate with advanced engineering in much more than a superficial way. In this sense, and strictly in this sense, architecture has finally become modern. Banham's ghost is no doubt feeling gratified these days. Tafuri's ghost? Not so much. The hegemony of capitalism offers little more reason in 2013 than in 1973 to place hopes in design, as the Marxian historian put it in his attack on the techno-rationalist utopism, the Speranza Progettuale, of Thomas Maldonado in the concluding salvo of Architecture and Utopia. Indeed, arguably less. Refusing the term postmodern because it implied that capitalist modernity had somehow managed to supersede itself in the late 20th century rather than, in fact, extend its imperial reach, Tafuri insisted on describing the signal work of his day as hypermodern. In the preface to his final book, Interpreting the Renaissance, which is only ostensibly confined to a study of what Tafuri considered the real origin of modernity, namely the period of 16th century humanism, he declared his own task as that of, quote, an elaboration of mourning. This melancholy project was aimed at both, quote, unsettling our present, as he puts it, and at the same time, more therapeutically, at confronting the crippling sense of loss engendered in members of his generation by the passing of the values and ideals associated with an earlier moment of modernism. The Venice historian undertook a more explicit farewell to the utopian ideology of modernism in The Sphere and the Labyrinth, which appeared in 1987 in English. This book, written over the course of the 1970s, was an effort to trace the history of the avant-garde in architecture at precisely the moment that a clamorous neo-avant-garde had emerged in Italy and around the world. Beginning with a formidable, not to say anguished, disquisition on method titled The Historical Project, followed by 2 chapters on Piranesi that cast the 17th century architect as a proto-avant-gardist who had been the first to reveal the subversive potential of transgression as a mode of aesthetic activity, and subsequently influencing Sergei Eisenstein's concept of cinematic montage based on dynamics of shock. The book concluded with 2 chapters on the 1970s. In between were a series of chapters on what we conventionally think of as the heroic period of the avant-garde, and its most important episodes in Germany, the Soviet Union, and the US. In these, Tafuri iteratively, almost traumatically, we could say, told the story of how left-wing architects, believing their anti-bourgeois forms and actions would serve radical social and political programs, unwittingly became pawns in the rationalization and reorganization of architectural production, reproducing and reinforcing the logic of techno-bureaucratic power. In an argument bearing some resemblance to one that Boris Groys would later make about how the totalistic aesthetic of the Soviet avant-garde anticipated the repressions of the next phase of Stalinism, the utopian ghost rising from the wreckage was no less that of the executed engineer in Magnitogorsk than, in the Western context, the tattered remnants of Ernst Bloch's principle of hope. In the final 2 chapters of The Sphere in the Labyrinth, titled L'Architecture dans le Boudoir and The Ashes of Jefferson, respectively, and focused on Tafuri's own time, 2 new ghosts entered the scene. For late modern architects striving to resuscitate any lingering residues of civic idealism in the 1950s and 60s, above all, Louis Kahn, the Enlightenment spirit of Thomas Jefferson would be channeled into an architecture that could only appear to Tafuri at this date as steeped in nostalgia and self-mystification. At the same time, in a purely dialectical, but also edible fashion, Kahn's other would emerge in the figure of Robert Venturi. Tafuri writes, quote, "To the promise of Kahn, communication is possible by giving voice to institutions, Robert Venturi has responded with the following objection. The only institution is the real, and only the real speaks. If Kahn could have produced a school of mystics without religions to defend, Venturi has in fact created a school of the disenchanted without any values to transgress." Venturi's return to the real, in other words, was not a bona fide new foundation for contemporary architecture, but rather an equally escapist immersion in the empty world of commodities and pop culture. For Tafuri, the 2 architects offered equally untenable options. Quote, "In the operations performed by Kahn and Venturi, it makes little difference whether the material of the new image system is made up of dreams of non-existent institutions or of nightmares dominated by the crowding together of the ephemeral icons of cosmic merchandising. The order without center of Kahn and the too ambiguous of Venturi find in this their fluctuating point of convergence." Meanwhile, in the Tafurian account, the narrative strategy of which Jameson was first to baptize dialectical historiography, a second ghost turns out to have been lurking all along behind the Jeffersonian one. This would be the Marquis de Sade, whose cruel inspiration underwrites neo-avant-garde architectural projects from Aldo Rossi to the New York Five, which Tafuri can only describe as somehow being sadomasochistic, whether cynically or laconically forced to acknowledge their own impotence and irrelevance. In this context, what once, in the 1920s, were languages of battle have now, according to Tafori, merely become languages of pleasure, frivolous entertainments. The pleasure to be derived from these often subtle and exquisite formal inventions, Tafori writes, is entirely mental. Quote, there's clearly no social value in this. In fact, the writing of The Ashes of Jefferson was triggered by a particular historical context. New York City was on the verge of bankruptcy, and competition for a second phase of housing on Roosevelt Island had just been canceled, relegating the large volume of submissions to paper speculations memorialized in a catalog. In this interesting document, we find a spectrum of more or less realistic speculations, including these two by O.M. Ungers and Robert A.M. Stern, the latter paying homage to Jane Jacobs and singled out by the jury for commendation. We also find this project, which, since it isn't usually included in the Eisenman canon, I thought I would bring tonight. As you see, it says Peter Eisenman and Peter Cook and another team, but I'm sure we'll hear more from Peter later on that. As you see, the cylindrical parking structures of Luke Kahn's Philadelphia plan have here been repurposed as housing, but with the defensiveness of fortresses, more sod than Kahn. But two last points about Kahn and Tafori before I come to my conclusion. It seems that in the end, Kahn got final word on Roosevelt Island. But also worth mentioning is another subtext or intertext for Tafori's Jefferson. In his poem, The Ashes of Gramsci, Pier Paolo Pasolini elegizes Italy's most important political philosopher, an intellectual who aspired to a Republican public realm in Italy that in certain ways might be seen as parallel to that of Jefferson. So yet another dialectical other here. Well, half a century on, how many degrees of separation really exist between us and the late modern morning of a Pasolini, a Tafori, or even a Peter Blake? Blake's God's Own Junkyard in 1964 already decried the despoliation of the landscape, the defouling of our environment, that Rem Koolhaas would render in apocalyptic terms in his poem, his great poem, Junk Space. But Blake opens his book by stating, this book is not written in anger, it is written in fury, while Koolhaas revels in gallows humor, at least ostensibly. Is this a measure of the distance between 1964 and 2001? Or is cynicism really a facade with Rem, a Taforian mask, concealing just as much vitriol as Blake's black and white photographic juxtapositions expose? I don't know whether today we have yet had, or indeed had, a surfeit of irony. Many young architects seem much more earnest these days to me. The organizers asked, is revolutionary architecture even possible? What a strange way of putting it, even possible. Was it ever possible? If modernity is at this point a synonym for capitalism, which is what Jameson ultimately proposes, architects are not all that likely to be exchange agents in the practice of their profession. That's the way it is. Whatever advanced stage we are living in the early 21st century, the end of capitalist modernity is hardly on the horizon. But what looks like a choice between naivete and negativity isn't one. The urban world has always been architecture's primary sphere of activity, and today it's being affected by ever-worsening disparities of wealth and poverty, increasing dangers from climate change, the ravages of 21st century war and turmoil. By 2050, according to UN projections, 70% of the world is expected to be urbanized. At the date Le Corbusier drew up a city for 3 million inhabitants, just over 24 metropolitan regions in the world had 1 million or more people. Today, there are more than 400 cities, over 1 million, and 19 over 10 million. Architecture is less and less a trivial pursuit, even if some architects thought it was one as recently as the 1970s. Ironically, let's finish up with this up here. Well, sorry, I'm missing a page of my script here, but I just want to finish up with this. Ironically, at a moment when we are all captivated by cyberspace, we also seem to be weighing ever more heavily on the planet Earth, and our bodies are, even though we're living these more spectral lives in cyberspace, we're also continuing to be even more materially here. The fictions of post-industrialism, immaterial labor, and the connectionist world of networks, flexibility, integration, and project-based forms of labor are highly ideological constructions, ignoring the realities of real bodies in real space, of real suffering, of precarious forms of existence, lived not in a post-human but subhuman condition for many. The reason that architects should strive to practice responsibly, if that's the word, is not that it's always better to do no harm, but that there are such big problems out there. And today, architects, as both urban specialists and visionary thinkers, may really be able to do something about them. We said earlier that the ghost of Banham would be glad to see architects becoming more sophisticated technologically. Of course, technology, like architecture, always needs to be put into a social and political context. Walter Benjamin wrote in 1935, "Dialectical thinking is the organ of historical awakening. Every epoch not only dreams the one to follow, but in dreaming precipitates its own awakening. It bears its end within itself and unfolds it with cunning." He continued rather too optimistically, speaking about the Paris of the 19th century, quote, "With the destabling of the market economy, we begin to recognize the monuments of the bourgeoisie as ruins even before they have crumbled." The monuments have hardly crumbled. Perhaps our most pressing current task is to find a way beyond both technological triumphalism and a sense of historical helplessness, to face rather than blow backward into the coming storms. Thanks.
Okay, so once you get reseated,
It's in certain ways very much, the four corners of a square. If you propose now on four corners for champion organizers, you hear me there? No. Okay. So, well, in about 4 or 5 years, it will be 100 years since the 1917 Russian Revolution. 1917 plus 50 years, 1918, let's say, plus 50 years, that gives me 1968, and then another few years, and we'll have, an interesting
set of historical dates. So I'd like perhaps to try to touch upon these 3 dates and see to which extent what we see is not a recurrent issue that will always have to do with anyone attempting to discuss architecture and politics. 1917, St. Petersburg, in a 19th century neoclassical architecture, there is a revolution. Artists, writers, architects work together, develop a new sensibility with a social agenda. They talk about communal kitchen, they talk about new social relations. And then you ask yourself, but does this change society? Communal kitchen, social relations, but what about the mode of production? Very soon they realize that their workers' clubs are not going to change the society. Something else has to happen. And of course something else happens, not at all what they would have liked. 1968, slogans. Imagination takes power. Détournement. Urban insurgency. Let's see now what happened to my friends. Some pretend that nothing ever happened and went happily building up practices. Talking about architecture. Some went to the side of power politics. Sometimes very hot politics. Groups called Potere Operario or Red Army Faction. Fascinated by the fact that urban insurgency in Derry and Belfast was almost succeeding. Others talked about exemplary actions. By exemplary actions, they meant, for example, getting into a French suburb, or rather working class post-war housing, and building a house of the people with stolen or borrowed material, but building it themselves without at all the help of banks or of whatever power structure. That was an exemplary action. We could take faith on the own. Or giving lectures in department stores about the issues that went with consumerism, for example. For the group, rather than going on the side of power, in that equation, imagination takes power, went on to the side of imagination. On one hand, it meant going into advertising, furniture design, or, if I think of groups like Zoom or Super Studio, quite interestingly, asked themselves where we were going. Where was the system going? And started to do a number of projects where they said, let's verify where the system is going. What was interesting with what we were doing is that they were not abandoning architecture, were not trying to practice it as if anything had ever happened, but trying to build up scenarios and looking what were the different possibilities in a relatively creative but also probably cynical manner, but sufficiently creative to suggest that architecture still had a role to play. They call themselves radical architecture. The fifth group called themselves rational architecture. And Joan just alluded to them. When they started to talk about architecture having very little to do with politics, and using the word autonomy, and saying things like, there is no such thing as fascist architecture, There is no such thing as socialist architecture. There is only architecture in a fascist regime or architecture in a socialist regime. So, looking at what was constant in history, they started to use the word memory. I remember myself, in 1976, before the La Villette competition, there was another one, which was just an idea competition. And the one that, for you, among you, who may remember, Leon Krier did quite an extraordinary set of Tutors for social housing. He did an extraordinary project which had an enormous influence on the generation. As I was about to submit this idea competition, a friend of mine called Roland Castro, who was one of the main political leaders of the 68 events in Paris at the school, at the École des Beaux-Arts, was driving around the block where I lived in his moped. I was taking a coffee, and I knew we had to submit that later that afternoon. And while I'm sipping my coffee, he's riding again and again. So by the third time I stopped him, and I asked him, "What are you doing? Aren't you working on your competition?" I knew he was doing it. And he said, No, I'm waiting for my appointment with Lacan, who was having a psychoanalysis, to ask him whether I should submit or not. Now, why would he do such a thing? Of course, he didn't want to leave architecture altogether. He felt that if architecture had to do with the side of power, the side of money, it had to reconcile himself with power, reconcile himself with his father, hence he went into a psychoanalysis. Also a psychoanalyst of language. So that gets me to my conclusion. Language is an interesting and important issue in all that. If you remember, or if you know, and we all do, that all the metaphors of power and all the political metaphors are always architecture. We talk about foundation, we talk about pyramid, we talk about labyrinth, we talk about structure, base, pillars, stone, stepping stone. That's how our society has built its own way to function. So my suggestion would be, why don't we try, even only in the way our friends from Super Studio Artism did, try to use a new vocabulary, the vocabulary that we use as architects of the so-called avant-garde, but everybody uses it. In other words, filters, screens, meshes, exoskeleton, and diagrams. We see if we can build a different type of society. Thank you.
Yeah, I'd like to raise a couple of points based on the presentations, and then allow the panelists to respond to each other's remarks. Reinhold, you you gestured towards the simplicity of architecture with reality. And this it's almost sort of de facto rear guard. The rear guard character of its action, sort of to orient the point. I wonder, however, though, if architecture tails behind reality in the current, the political character of reality, if revolutionary architecture can occur when reality itself possesses a sort of revolutionary character. In other words, when a revolutionary politics or revolutionary social transformation is taking place, whether or not architecture can then perhaps, following that sort of revolutionary reality, play a revolutionary role. I guess that sort of gets to Joan's point as well, when you were talking about perhaps, whether revolutionary architecture is ever possible, and perhaps a sort of a socially responsible way to alleviate, conditions of subhumanity, whether or not, perhaps, in terms of a revolutionary architectural practice today, whether that could be autonomously, the point that Bernard made, whether that could be autonomously facilitated, or whether or not it would presume a sort of social project. In other words, if perhaps the pseudo-architecture today, or the pseudo-revolutionary character of architecture today, mirrors a sort of pseudo-reality, a sort of pseudo-revolutionary reality. Maybe speaking to the point that architecture and reality sort of thing. Yeah.
How about this? What I meant in trying to, in a sense, answer your question backwards about revolutionary architecture is in a sense, say yes, but from the other direction, which is another way, I think, of describing what you're describing. We are surrounded by revolutionary architecture. We're in revolutionary architecture right now. But it's a different revolution. No, it's true. It's a different revolution from the one that you're imagining. And I think the one many of us imagine. So, in other words, architecture in its immanence, as it were, complicity or not, it's not so much that it's some pure soul that, is going to be tainted by capital and whatever. It's precisely the material and imagined immanence of a building, a thing like this, in all the circuitry that we are actually describing when you use a word like capital or whatever. That enables it, this thing that we're in, to mediate actively the instantiation, the reproduction of that system. And that system is today revolutionary, but in a different, in effect, the opposite direction. So the wheel is, it's revolution. It's turning the other way. And your reaction. For example, one way to kind of verify or test these things. As of course, I love Bernard's the two things that the kind of role of the kind of research practice to verify things going, but also is to see even how much I would like that a new vocabulary could develop. Actually, one can go into boardrooms around the city and hear language of meshes and networks and filters, that sort of thing. And in effect, that's one of the architecture of this new revolutionary society that's going the other direction is precisely the architecture of a kind of vanguard, but again, not the sort that one might wish to welcome. Or more historically, one can move around Europe, particularly southern Europe today, and witness firsthand, and in the United States, of course, and virtually everywhere else in the world in different ways, another kind of architectural act, one of dismantling. It's kind of like the other side of your inventory of figures is the demolition of these various figures, is the dismantling of, I think this was Peter's quotation here, Victoria, of Weber State and the infrastructures of the modern city. So this is all active, and this is revolutionary in its own way. A revolution, as it were, from below, of the kind that I think I am alluding to. Rosa Luxemburg's revolution is a different story. We can talk about that for other issues.
Just referring to the room we're in, it's not reactionary, it's not revolutionary, it's nothing. And we even grace it with proto-revolutionary, proto-reactionary. Come on. The trouble is that most building today has nothing to do with reactionary or revolutionary. It's just nothing. I think the only revolutionary possibility for architecture is in its own discipline. Whether that's an autonomous thing or not, I don't know, because it seems to me that none of us are asked, for example, in the 1920s, housing projects were symbols of a potential social revolution. They were counters in the world. Today, housing projects are financed most of the time by developers for high-end luxury things. So, housing is no longer a counter to ameliorate the social. So, I don't know whether architecture, and I hate to be the one person who would like to think that we are not able, I think, in architecture to be revolutionary in the context of what that means. And I always point to the fact that in Soviet Russia, they lock up poets, they lock up painters, they lock up writers. I've never heard of an architect ever being locked up because they're not dangerous. What they do has very little to do with threatening either right-wing regimes or left-wing regimes. They don't. And when was the last time, even in reformist society, like I would say, late capitalism in the United States, when was the last time any architect was asked to do anything of significance by a reformist government? They're not thought of. The people that work for the governments, in fact, are neither revolutionary, reformists. They are merely nothing. And I'm sorry. And that may be a wildly radical statement, but most of the architects that work for this institution, as we can see, produce nothing. That is a real challenge to revolution.
If I can maybe ask a follow-up to that, would you agree then with the position that Bernard characterized as there is no fascist architecture, there is no socialist architecture, there is no architecture under fascist or socialist regimes? Would you agree with that statement?
I mean, Leon Krier is a very conservative architect. I wouldn't call him a fascist architect. He doesn't serve a fascist client, nor is he intending to. Albert Speer was a fascist architect producing architecture that was symbolic of the regime. One might say, but we have the same architecture in the U.S. Capitol. You can go through building after building. They look like Marcello Piacentini. They look like Leon Krier. So what are we talking about? I'm not convinced that there is such a thing as a fascist architecture or a left-wing architecture, because if so, the fascists, the symbol of the fascist regime in Italy, is all over the courthouse in Columbus, Ohio. All of the railings in Columbus, Ohio are fascist. So if that's fascist architecture, then it is. But I don't think there is such a thing.
John, I mean, this is an old argument. It's been made endlessly. Just to take the side of the devil's advocate for a second, I think we have to acknowledge that architecture is a powerful form of symbolic representation. It speaks. It carries messages. It conveys ideas, and it belongs to a particular context. It's true that it's a silly game to try to identify particular iconography with this or that regime. Nonetheless, when when a particular iconography is put in a particular context and rendered at a certain scale and is functioning in a particular way, it does carry meaning. It's not an empty signifier.
So I guess the question is whether architecture has any sort of ideological content. And just as a point, I mean, architecture, Mikhail Kitovich was killed by the Soviet government. And he was an architect that is urbanist, associated with Moshe Ginsburg. So that might have been due to his Trotskyism. Anyway, I was wondering if perhaps Bernard could expand on a point. He was much more exhaustive about the aftermath of 1968 and the various ways that architecture and politics were parsed subsequent to that moment. You only briefly glossed the post-1917 moment, the collective kitchens and so on, and how things didn't go the way that these radical architects in the Soviet Union would have wished. I would add, perhaps, also all of the other foreign architects working in the Soviet Union, of which there were many. I was wondering if perhaps you could go into how things didn't play out. I mean, whether it was something imminent to architectural practice itself, inherently unrealizable, or something just due to political circumstances, extra architectural reasons that things didn't pan out the way they hoped.
I'm going to try to answer your question sideways, actually. And I'm going to answer through a statement, two statements made by Joan. One I totally disagree with, and one I absolutely agree with. I'll start with the one I disagree with, is that architecture is a powerful symbolic tool of symbolic representation that carries meaning. Yes, it carries what you want to give, the meaning you want to give to it. But one of the issues that architecture as one of its really responsibilities today is to try to alter these meanings and those symbolic representations. Writers can do it, musicians can do it, and architects do it also. But too many of them are only too happy to continue developing the same cliches and the same dictionaries of received ideas. And in this respect, I think there's a lot of work still in front of us. We have a lot, architecture is a very young discipline. In other words, we have not yet exhausted any of the things we can do. So that's the first point. The second point, where I really would agree and applaud with the conclusion of Joan, is when you said that faced with the crisis today, architects may be able to do something. The reason why I say that is that as a practicing architect, I find often myself confronted with bankers, plumbers, politicians, and traffic engineers. And none of them have the slightest idea how they should solve relatively simple urban or even architecture problems. They can talk about plumbing, they can talk about banking, they can talk about politics. But the only people who have an overview or capable of trying to put all these things together are often architects. And that's where I would have a slight disagreement with Peter when you say that it's only within architecture that you will find architecture. You need somehow architecture as that particularity. There's always an exterior, there's always an extrinsic, side to it. It's never pure. And it's exactly all these issues that possibly make our crisis today that can feed the beast being architecture, and let us, invent other ideas. Architecture is the invention of ideas, and then we to materialize them. So let's try to do that.
I was wondering maybe about Joan's presentation. You made the point, you alluded to Frederick Jameson's argument, equating capitalism with modernity. And based on that equation, whether or not architectural modernism, insofar as it was bound up with Russian modernity, whether or not it could ever lead to a sort of revolutionary consequence. I guess the question is whether or not modernism or modernity or capitalism, if the two are coextensive, might have at one point, perhaps still does, point beyond itself. Whether or not capitalism potentially does contain within it possibilities which are not realized in its present form, and whether or not perhaps the problem with modernity today, or if modernism still does exist, or post-modernity or hyper-modernity, as the theory about it, is whether or not this kind of imminent potential of capital modernism might supersede itself. Maybe that possibility is fake.
I think by the term modernism, and I at some point I'd like to respond to Reinhold's redefinition of the word revolutionary. I think I'm for common sense use of language, and to respond on this question of revolution, I think by common sense tells us that when we're talking about revolution, particularly in this setting, we have in mind the overturning of a dominant system, and to suggest that capitalism is revolutionary is in a way a contradiction in terms. With respect to modernism, modernism we can simply define as a response to the condition of modernity, or to the processes of modernization. We define modernity as capitalism, along with Jameson, then modernism would be a response to capitalism. But that response can occupy the full spectrum of from yes to no, from embracing it to criticizing it, to trying to move beyond it, as you're suggesting. So I think also we should be very careful about our use of terms, which then leads me to another term that's been bouncing around here that I would like to pose as a question to everyone on the panel or even to the audience. This term avant-garde and what we mean by that, and whether this is not a term and an idea that's been so abused and so exhausted that it shouldn't be consigned to the dustbin of 20th century ideas, or whether it still, as Peter was suggesting, does have some juice and some value in perpetuating. But anyway, just arguing for kind of clear terminology.
Okay. I would want to clarify this point. At least with Marx's understanding of capitalism, or the role of the bourgeoisie in history, Marx contended that capitalism was, above all, revolutionary. It was the perpetual overturning of existing conditions, all of the solid melts into air. I wonder if perhaps it's rather just that sort of perpetual change, the kind of repetitive dynamism, isn't perhaps just the more things change, the more they stay the same. I mean, if it's become more of just the same, or the old in distress rather than a new presenting itself, and whether or not perhaps modernism at one point might have expressed possibilities that later either sank beneath the surface, or I guess maybe complicating the sort of commonsensical approach towards is perhaps that historically these terms shift, or there's significant shifts.
That's fair. Of course, Marx is also talking about capitalism at an earlier moment, or not at a moment when it has become so totally institutionalized.
Yeah, no, okay, I mean, you said it, I think, very well. Another shorthand way of saying this is the dialectical concept of evolution. In other words, it is more strictly Marxian, but not exclusively Marxian idea. And it's what partly I meant in speaking about tables turning and things like that. You can ask the Greeks. They're learning very well how revolutionary naturalization actually is. And we, these lessons can be learned in our own backyard in ways that we also continue to seem to be surprised by. Anyway, the other, it's hard not to have, like, this sort of conversation among friends and colleagues is interesting, but it's hard in some sense to escape the familiar, the usual discussions. I mean, we've been having things about avant-garde and fascist, socialist for decades, and I agree that some of this ought to be at some level suppressed. But also, I want to talk about conception for a second, just for fun. Because there also is a kind of provincialism to these terms. And it is shocking how we continue to project our categories onto, in some, like rather narcissistic way, onto the world as such, onto things that are going on right now that actually are not assimilable into, the kind of very Eurocentric, very, very specific kind of analytic, however robust, and I agree with Joan very much about the proof's ongoing relevance, but nevertheless, narrow and limited in very specific ways. He speaks about Algiers, for example, in a very, very strange way when you read the kind of things that he was no doubt reading about the anti-colonial struggles there. So, so the question is, at some level, how do we not speak as though we're at a sort of faculty meeting or something, or the kind of architecture conference, and try to think with and or outside of our categories. And that's one of the reasons that I, for example, wanted to evoke abstraction. I think actually, for example, the image that you showed, John, of the Koolhaas building is an excellent thing. I mean, one could do it from that or from the construction side, because one of the extraordinary, Corey may not have had access to the knowledge that we have of Jefferson's biography, but surely it was clear to him that he was a slave owner. And the kind of image of Jefferson is an enlightening kind of model that then gets corrupted or aestheticized at time and so on and so forth is a cliche. I mean, it's absolutely then cliche and it remains a cliche. So we locally we need to break that open. Likewise, in speaking about abstraction, I am referring specifically not only to the very beautiful skyscraper that Eisenman designed, and I do think it's a beautiful building. Not just a beautiful, it's a very compelling and very, it's a building that makes you think. But I'm talking about the abstraction that was in the foreground of the photograph, which I suspect he deliberately chose for that reason. But the point being that not simply that the big architectural monolith in the background, monument to, not to specifically American-style capitalism, but authoritarian capitalism in this case. Different, not Jefferson. One is like, abstract, and the other is real and on the ground and available to political action, but precisely that the state, that housing, and specifically probably state housing that we were photographing that's shown. Correct? Well, no, that seems to be more, I don't know, anyway, I mean, I was imagining local housing. But anyway, that is as equally is sort of, as it were, abstracted in its very juxtaposition to that, and not only because we continue to aestheticize poverty in some of these practices that I think we've already cited, but also because that poverty is being produced It's being produced actively through not just sheer and raw power, but through all of the banks and all of the machinery that the architecture itself is acknowledging. So it's a different world.
I want to go back to the idea that the only revolutionary possibilities in the discipline. I want to cite two examples. One, I would argue that Hitler did not close the Bauhaus for aesthetic reasons. In other words, for disciplinary reasons, he closed it for very clearly political reasons. And if I were to say a modicum, not the people in this room, let's say, but students that I run into today are very little interested in the discipline because they don't feel the discipline has any validity in the commercial world that they need to get to. They need to study Revit, kind of machinery for producing drawings, and they need to have Maya and Rhino, they need computer programs, etc. And I would argue it's precisely that they're quite aware of the fact that the discipline has no value for many of them in today's society. And if something has no value in today's society, then quite possibly it could stand as revolutionary in itself.
I'd like to open it up to audience questions. If you could come down and then use the microphone. We don't have mobile.
Okay, I guess I wanted to just put a lot of these cards on the table. I personally, as someone who studied art at Scoldior Institute at Chicago, I think agree in most part with the idea that insofar as the revolutionary character of art is concerned, you are posing the question constantly within the work of what is art, what is this discipline about. So I think that in that part you're among friends. However, the larger kind of problem that some of us in Platypus have asked ourselves is within a conservative society, what are the possibilities for asking those types of radical questions about the discipline? What is the relationship? I think that you put it in terms of if politics to some extent is articulated as the art of the possible, and art to some extent mimics or attempts to think about that somehow in the work. And what does it mean to make art in an extremely conservative world? Is the artist then somehow free from the fetters of this conservative society? Somehow exists outside of those limitations? I think some of us think about the early 20th century as potentially a moment in which those questions were not only part of a cultural problem, but part of a political one, and thus perhaps opportunities were open that are not open today. Maybe not. But I think that's the question about the revolutionary character of art. Not so much as a kind of instrumentality or propaganda, but rather, what does it mean to make art in an extremely conservative present?
Is there a possibility that there's art without a political comment? I mean, can you be a great artist in a non-revolutionary time or a conservative time? Great art is not dependent necessarily on its context. I mean, Jackson Pollock, I'm not convinced came out of a context. He came out of psychotherapy, frankly. I mean, he was a figurative artist until he got into psychotherapy and started making sandcastles for his therapist. I know this was his therapist, was my father. Jackson Pollock's a great artist. we can have Jackson Pollocks today that might have nothing to do with the political or social realm. It's possible. The same thing that, for example, Thomas Pynchon is writing another novel, right? Thomas Pynchon is a great writer. He keeps himself out of the political, out of the social. He's a hermit, right? Is it possible to write a great novel being cut off from the present?
Hold on, I'm not arguing that. Let me clarify. It's not the case that artists have to be informed and be part of the political arena and read newspapers. If you do that, that's fantastic. If you don't, well, okay. I'm not asking that. I guess what I'm asking is that insofar as we live in a conservative society today, are possibilities for making great art limited? Are they not? What is the relationship? Let's not make it a declarative of whether you can have great artists today. What is the relationship between art making and present possibilities for social transformation? I'll leave it at that.
Yes, you're asking several questions. I'll extend, but taking a different angle at what Peter just said. You have to remember that there's the now thing in architecture. There is built architecture and unbuilt architecture. Both are equally valid. They are equally part of the human activity. Call it a discipline, call it whatever. But if it's unbuilt, it can be done by a few people or even one single person. And there is absolutely fantastic work, and I would say still of the avant-garde. I'm currently curating an exhibition of work between 1950 and today, where practically nothing has been built. But those works are shown, and we have names like Constant, Guy Debord, Peter Eisenman, Peter Cook, Walter Fischler, and even Pierre Vittorio Aureli, Dino Blanc, Cassia, Friedman, and many others. And they are really very important piece of work. Architecture is a form of knowledge that I keep repeating, and it takes place also in the non-built environment. When you reach the built environment, you're talking about pieces of work that needs 300 or 3,000 workers, from the guy who is pushing the goods to extremely sophisticated engineers and so on. They work together. It's extremely expensive. Someone has to pay for it. It's not an improvised piece of avant-garde anymore. It means that at that moment it has to be coveted by a number of powers, be it once upon a time military or religious, today it's banking or again politics, or private developers, and that somehow changed the nature of the beast, but at the same time it's still part of the same knowledge or the same activity.
I mean, I guess that goes to my question. Which is like sort of astonishing to the whole discussion about architecture omits the obvious fact that the reason that architecture don't seem architecture to things. Architecture depends on clients. It depends on wealthy people, wealthy corporations, or the state, or in the past, the church, or some institution. You can speak about unbuilt architecture and built architecture, but for most of us who live in cities, what we experience on a day-to-day basis is the built architecture, not the unbuilt architecture. And I mean, that goes to the question of the failure of revolutionary architecture. I mean, for architecture to be revolutionary, you have to have clients who would support a revolutionary architecture, who would pay for it. And who would that be? I mean that would be the question. I mean, because the idea that sort of architects would subvert their clients' interests seems absurd to me. I mean, that's the bottom line. I mean, so what are people talking about? I mean, if you have a revolutionary state with a revolutionary project, then it might hire a revolutionary architecture. But otherwise, you live in a society where architecture has to serve power. And I guess the other question I have is, some of the most beautiful buildings I know are in the service of dubious ideological projects, such as glorifying the Catholic Church.
I used to agree with Tafuri that revolutionary dreams of modernism were exhausted. And then the thing that changed my mind was Pussy Riot. Pussy Riot, you know about the Pussy Riot event. This was an architectural intervention. And in a way, what it does, and I'm actually surprised in some ways that Bernard didn't speak to this issue, because Pussy Riot's language is the language of '68. And in a sense, their success, and I think it was a profound political success, is in a lot of ways a vindication of the dreams of Paris '68, although the Situationists et al. And so, curious what your thoughts were about Pussy Riot specifically and the issues about avant-gardism in general. Bernard?
Yes, you're absolutely correct about the fact that individual can at any moment take advantage of certain circumstances or the power of media in order to exert some sort of influence. Take the historical example, Mussolini takes over Rome in 1921 or 22 with an army of 30 people who uses the media. So this can go one way or another. That's an interesting and important fact. I would like to make another fact about the previous person who asked the question and said, well, you can talk about ideas and you can talk about ambient architecture, but we live within built architecture. Sure, you're right. I'm currently reading a very interesting book that's going to come out in a few months, I guess, called The Country of Cities. Like some of you know Vijan Chakrabarti, who has been working with the city, and it's sort of somewhere bridging the gap between architecture, planning, and finance. And who is making a very, informed point about the necessity of density, that we cannot continue living in the way we are in our exploded, sort of atomized environment, and that with very good facts shows that a city like New York uses about 20 times less energy than a city like Dallas. And argues a point that planners and architects should try to convince the world that, you have to build cities, but not the way we do it. And that's the only way to get through. And in this respect, I think it's not only the architect, it's all you guys to have to put the right amount of pressure on the politicians around you, so that certain things are being handled, perhaps through the wisdom, hopefully, of architects and planners.
I don't have any specific comments on Pussy Riot, but I just want to say one thing apropos of Tafuri, since I spent so much time talking about him. I'm not arguing for ongoing relevance. I mean, yes, ongoing. I think he needs to be dealt with. We need to contend with him. But one of the arguments I was trying to make is that Tafuri got locked into this kind of endless mourning. I mean, really melancholy rather than mourning, because according to Freud, mourning is something that you work through and get over, and melancholy is something that just goes on and on. It's like a depression, actually, and you never exorcise it. I think one of the possibilities is that a different generation than we represent up here for you people is that you're not having to go through that process. That those of us who went through the disappointment, the disillusionment of '68 and things that happened surrounding it, had to work all that stuff through, and we've still got it in our somehow system. And those of you who don't have a kind of fresher start on this, and that's why even if, at the risk of a certain kind of naivete about revolutionary architecture, we are now kind of resuscitating this concept, you can afford to take a risk now because you know you're fresher, and that's good. I think that's great. And there's certain avant-garde technique strategies, whether it's shock or kind of agility, whatever Pussy Riot used to be as successful as it was. These things may not be all used up yet. I mean, they may still have a little juice in them, so sure, take advantage of those. But on the other hand, I think you can't not know history, and from that standpoint, I think Tagore is essential.
I have a question for Peter. I'm a little bit confused because you said at the beginning that architects never get locked up, that we're like powerless in a way. And then you said that Hitler didn't close the Bauhaus because of aesthetic reasons.
That's correct.
So then isn't that quite contradictory?
No, I just stating fact.
But then they are like powerful.
What about degenerate art?
Yeah, I retract what I said. Architects are very good. I must say, I want to reiterate something about Pussy Riots and Manfredo Tafuri. To understand that Manfredo Tafuri is different than, or the Pussy Riots are in a different situation, you have to know Tafuri to know the difference. And if you don't, you just take the Pussy Riots as just another happening in today's condition. I would argue that anybody who is an architect, a student of architecture, whatever, not citizens of the world, but architects, have to know their discipline, have to know the history of their discipline, and this is something that if you just know about the Pussy Riots, then you don't know much about your discipline. And I would argue that Tafuri, along with Banham, along with several others, are important people for any architect, whether they are going to be revolutionary, avant-garde, whatever. Tafuri is a lesson necessary to know.
It is part of it. It is actually an architectural language. Language of Pussy Riot.
Yeah, I know. What I'm saying is, to know the difference, you have to know Tafuri.
Sorry, right. Sorry.
Okay. Yeah, I actually thought this was going to be a bit more political than this sort of, it really is like sitting on an architecture jury. It's fun. I mean, it's enjoyable, but yeah. But to add another date to make it more imminent, more to Bernard's, sequence, it's astonishing that 2012 is not immediately in the air. And it's possible because that date doesn't actually fit within quite as easily within the narrative of the avant-garde. And never mind, okay. You were in the countryside, the capital cities. Yes. Yeah. Well, yes, and then we have things that happen, that continue to happen, ongoing events of great urgency in cities and beyond.
What about 2008?
Yeah, no, of course we can.
That's even more important.
You can say, yeah. But the point, the bigger point being that these, the ongoing transformation of the Middle East and the internal dissent here in headquarters vis-a-vis not just Wall Street, but basically the entire apparatus of 2000. And so it seems to me that if we're going to seriously consider, let's say, the relationship of, broadly speaking, art and politics, or however you want to set that one up, in such a context, we have to change our, let's say, the reference, or at least expand the field, the political field, the historical field, and the discursive field, in order to take into account. Just saying one more footnote, I will be kind of back to the architectural esoteric act. Everybody here knows that I, among other things, am a student of George Rousseau, who was the prodigal son of Freda Tafuri, and one of the ways in which this field has been expanded, and it's surprising not to hear it come up, at least from the audience, is in the direction, in Foucauldian or post-Foucauldian direction, of a biopolitical analytics of power. And this is not something that Tafuri was and company precisely because of his Frankfurt School legacy that were informing that particular dialectic, the dialectic of Enlightenment from Jefferson to Steele, that organized that particular and as we say, very potent analysis. Change the footnotes, essentially, change the illustrations, and change the terms, and you do open other possibilities. You open other questions, other problems, other dilemmas. They are not the problem of the avant-garde, but they are legitimate and important ones. And if I wanted at least to
Actually, if I may use the point that the Pussy Riot intervention perhaps raise a question to the panelists. What's kind of more interesting, I think, is that I believe the performance that they staged was in the Church of the Savior in Moscow, which is historically the church that was rebuilt after the fall of the Soviet Union, which had been built in the 1860s through the 1880s, 40 years of backbreaking peasant labor, and then which was built on a former monastic site, so the Russian peasants felt that it was cursed. That was then blown up by Stalin. But the original plan to blow up the church originated with the avant-garde, with the rationalists. And I guess that sort of radicalism, like this, to juxtapose the radicalism of, say, like a sort of détournement of Pussy Riot and the 68 tradition versus the sort of radical nihilism of a kind of just, of dynamite the church, and then planning to build the palace of the Soviets in its place, the Corbusier image. If perhaps that kind of different political imagination informing the two different acts of vandalism, whether it be this sort of performative, blasphemous, obscene version, or just or the version that Stalin and before him the avant-garde proposed of dynamiting it, perhaps speaks to two different kinds of political imaginations.
Sorry, I'm going to bring it back to sort of less political but more internal, maybe for Professor Eisenman's topic of how architecture can't be revolutionary except for within its own sort of sphere. But looking at it, reading Robin Evans' Figures, Doors, and Passageways, talking about the shift from the matrix space to the linear corridor space, that's an internal revolution in terms of the actual spatial configuration of architecture, but also expresses a significant social revolutionary change. And you yourself have put a column in a master bed, like splitting a master bed, which is a very sort of revolutionary architectural act, which goes beyond the limits of architecture. So can you maybe sort of, is there sort of and looking more maybe at how modernism fails as its
revolutionary plan was the free plan, which was never adopted as a sort of new space. But it's not a left or right thing, but there are opportunities within architecture to create social revolutions that are based within a production of space.
No question. I would argue that the column that I placed in the bedroom was an architectural act. I didn't mean it to be a social or political act. My client wanted it removed. I said, leave it there. This is a true story. For a year, and if you don't still like it, I'll take it out. A year later, he said, it's changed my whole life in the bedroom, leave it. But I didn't intend it that way. It could have unintended consequences, of course. So, yes, it can. I'm saying is that what I mean is a revolutionary act, and I happen to be teaching Alberti this spring, when Alberti says that the column is a decorative element, and it is a part of a cutout wall. That is a radical change, and what it meant for architecture, I think, is extraordinary. And all kinds of political ramifications come out from a radical change. I mean, he is the first person that conceptualized the ornamental nature of the column. That, to me, is what I mean by revolutionary. There are things within the discipline that, like in literature, Joyce's Finnegan's Wake is a radical gesture that may not seem to change anything. William Butler Yeats's poetry, I don't think it necessarily intended to show, but did more for the Irish Revolution than all the guns and butter that came over from Liverpool. Clearly, artistic acts have consequences, but they may not necessarily have been intended by their authors.
But they can be.
They can be, yes. But you don't set out, as a creative person, you don't set out to be a revolutionary, nor do you set out to be avant-garde. You set out to do your work, whatever that may be.
And even you yourself, when you work, you try to create a different kind of space. You create a new type of space, be it whether it's you're taking on a social space or an architectural space. You are still trying to
critical work of the status quo. That's why I can honestly say this is a work of the status quo, which 99% of the work is. And I would argue that we could change this space and make it a political space. Now, I can tell you, in my convention center in Columbus, Ohio, when we designed it, it had things that were slightly off of vertical, let's say. And when clients came to rent space, they felt ill. In fact, some of them even got visibly ill. And we had to change the space because the client told us they couldn't rent the space in its radical form. I didn't intend it for people to get ill or fall over. That's not. I was intending an architectural idea.
My question has to do with, well, in having a panel called The Ruins of Modernity in 2013, why there hasn't been any conversation about the politics of the Cold War and how that has or maybe hasn't faced limitations on the practice? And my second question, I think, relates to that one a lot, in that how has the educational model that you guys as practicing architects went through face limitations or possibilities into your practice?
What mean, what educational model is
I mean, you went to school to be an architect, right?
Okay.
But that institutional model is different from the one that was handed down or that surrounded the European model.
You mean they didn't go to school to be architects?
No, but I would imagine that going to school in the 1970s was.
I would argue this, that in Europe, the model for the firstborn child was to become a lawyer, a doctor, some kind of profession. And the second child went into the clergy, and the third child went into the military. And those were in the early 20th century. I would argue today, with, let's say, 6,000 students at the University of Venice, 7,000 or 8,000 at the Polytechnic in Milan, these are not going to be architects. But architecture now has become a model for understanding education, thinking about the world, as the military might have been, as the law was, as medicine was. So in that sense, there has been a radical shift in Europe, where architecture and urban thinking have become a model for educating the firstborn, secondborn. If I had to do it again, and this has to do with the model of education, I would never go to school to study architecture, because I think one has to become educated. And you don't know, I mean, I would study literature, philosophy, whatever, humanities, and then do architecture. So I've been radically opposed in many ways to undergraduate architectural education. It's a mistake because people are not ready to do architecture.
I just edited a 400-some page book on the history of architecture education. Maybe I'll offer some thoughts here. I think the architecture school is one of the sort of missing links in our conceptualization of the institution of architecture, our understanding of how architects turn out to be the way they are, and how they how they are shaped and formed, and the fact that so different systems of education come together, especially in the American context, where you have first a kind of apprenticeship model, and you have a technical one, and you have Beaux-Arts, and you have this infusion of the Bauhaus model into the American context, and somehow all of these have to be worked out and renegotiating each other makes for an interesting ferment in this story of architecture education in the 20th century, because traces of all those models remain. But which model it is that you're formed under does count. And speaking about revolutionary context, I think that education, school, is one site of profound transformation, has transformational potential, and we were talking about how people think, and this is what schools do. And schools are both extremely conservative places in that they perpetuate bodies of knowledge, they institutionalize things, they codify things, but at the same time, it's also the ultimate meeting place between different generations, between an older and a younger intellectual, and as such, they have explosive potential for difference, for new things to emerge. So I think we need to focus a lot more on the meaning and the potential of architecture education in our lives. I think that is one potentially radical site for change and difference. And I think it's happening in some schools right now too.
To agree with Peter, that implicitly the importance
of education is at the level of the liberal humanist education that precedes professional education, or maybe accompanies it depending on how one does it, is also to acknowledge the really different scope of it, I think, and I know this is in your book, but it's worth highlighting that the American model, architectural educational model, tends to be university-based. Not always, but much more frequently than in other parts of the world, where those are academies, polytechnics, and so on, are the norm. So the university, and it's not an accident that it's the UVA is up there as the first kind of monument to some quasi-revolution, illusory as it may have been. That as it basically what we're doing now, the contestable public sphere, and specifically contestable, that these four corners of the virtual square, whether it's red or black or white or whatever, can argue this out with you, is central, I think, and it is a very positive structural factor in this. It's not, and universities, by the way, on the front lines, the building that we're in, again, is evidence of it, of the front lines of the recolonization of spaces far, far away from where they build their monuments. So it's not by any means to romanticize university, but it is a very, very important thing, and I suspect that we could also talk about the overturning of models, post-68 educational models that flow precisely from the ideas that circulate in public spheres that do allow that circulation, which is becoming fewer and fewer and further between. Yeah.
So after this, I think we'll
yes, closing. Yes.
Just one footnote. To education, there are two models of education. The one where someone teaches you something that he or she knows and expects you to come up with exactly the same result. The other one is doing it much more in the form of a question and using the place of teaching, the school, as a place of research and of investigation. The best model, of course, would be a bit of both, but there have been too often models that were simply trying to make you fit into a mold. Of course, there have been other models that it's, that anything goes. That's perhaps that distinction which still needs to be made.
So I guess I have two questions. One, the first is that, and I think I might be close to Peter here, I'm not totally convinced I should care, even after this panel, about revolutionary architecture. I mean, I am convinced, and I came in convinced of this, that I should care about architecture that's not ugly and not cheap and not stupid and not boring, that people should be able to live and habit and be in spaces that are intelligent and interesting and good and beautiful. And I guess, so one, I'm not sure what the difference between that stuff and like revolutionary architecture would be. And my second question, though, sort of the directly political one, and this is more to the people who kind of spoke directly on politics, especially, God, I forgot your name, Joan. Sorry, and Reinhold, and also Bernard, is, what, insofar as it seems like the technical means for doing things like that, for allowing most people on this planet to live in like sensible, intelligent, interesting spaces are available, but that's manifestly not the case in most people's lives. Most people like close their eyes to the world they live in because it's so ugly. This world, would you need a social revolution for that to happen? I mean, really, like, is for people to live in intelligent, beautiful spaces, do you need a radical social overturn in order for that to happen?
You take it back.
answer your question. The last one, maybe on and I have to say that probably we agree your first definition is not really what we're talking about. Maybe we're branching off in different ways, but the sort of happy consumer model of a city, let's say, or even the sort of like bourgeois comfort, these are other ways of describing this. The service model of architecture is not what anybody here is referring to, whether at the level of a kind of, let's say, internal esoteric discussion about corners and bedrooms, or the possible consequences of those things at large. But the second one, this is how they're related. It seems to me one needs to expect more. This is essentially what I was saying. One needs to expect more. One of the most beautiful, I mean beautiful in the aesthetic sense as well as the political sense, about beautiful decisions made during Occupy Wall Street, I think, was the decision not to make demands. It's a complicated one, it's a difficult one, but it's not, it wasn't simply a practical, tactical decision, I think. There was a kind of, it remains an element of physical affect, right? And then again, that can be supplemented or transformed into in the spirit of raising expectations to demanding the impossible and things like that. I actually rather in this case answer your question in a much more straightforward way, and say the demand that ought to be on the table with respect to the world systems that we're talking about is simply that there ought to be fewer dead bodies. It's as simple as that. There ought to be fewer victims of this, of our world, and it's precisely that's the complicity we're talking about. The complicity is not simply that we work with the devils that we know, as it were. If we really take it over down the hall, we're going to be citing our colleague who's literally going to fall in our school, and Visham and I are constantly disagreeing. But precisely that we recognize that the sort of the violence, real, virtual, epistemic, and otherwise, of the decisions that we do make in offering our services. I mean that both as intellectuals and as professionals in form. So the stakes are higher. I think is what I'm trying to say. I'm not saying by any means that a building or a city or anything that architects have immediate professional access to is going to address that or solve that thing, but it can actually pose that question in that way. That's so the demand, the refusal demand is actually sort of a kind of exhortation to imagine what actually ought to be done. And so that's what I was saying about that.
Okay, I'd just like to invite the panelists to provide some closing remarks. Perhaps just piggybacking off of Jeremy's question, and something that Bernard said earlier about his friend that he knew who was going to therapy with the Lacan, and trying to reconcile himself to the fact that he lives in a world in which he is complicit with power. I guess it's less a question of whether or not one acts in concert or is subject to oneself to dealing with power, but rather who wields that power. Whether or not power, perhaps wielded by a revolutionary state, might be the kind of. I think that's really the question that Jeremy was asking, was whether or not it's sort of total social revolution, such that can produce a world worth living in, architecturally, in terms of a sort of built environment, sort of total architectural product, is only available perhaps with power, not through the renunciation of power, but rather through the use of power, the implementation of power for social ends. And that's, that poses the question, why, like, in terms of power, why is it that power is problematic today? No, the question, just to reformulate it very simply, is the question of complicity with power a question really of the sheer fact of power and the corrupting influence of power, or is it rather a question of who wields that kind of power? What power is what the ends of this sort of power is?
Hardly know where to end up here, but I keep kind of going back to the comment that somebody made here about the bottom line, which is that architects work for clients, architecture is enmeshed in real estate and economy and in everything. Architecture is not a studio practice. Paper architecture is one thing, and precisely because architecture, when built, has to compromise so profoundly with realities, it makes the paper project all the more significant, and yet the possibilities within the realm of change, given the embeddedness of architecture, its implication in everything, makes that very difficult in this discipline. So one, certainly understands, finds poignant, as indeed Manfredo Topori did, the work of Peter Eisenman or the New York Five at a particular moment, that this position, which went under the name of autonomy, seemed to be a response, a possible response to realities. I do finally also, as bottom line, agree with Reinhold that somehow architects have some responsibility to alleviate suffering. And the world is so complex and so interrelated now that for us to maintain a kind of elite professionalism in the face of the fact that our buildings are being built by labor forces that are constituted we don't know how, with resources that come from we don't know where. It's interesting to think, for example, that the titanium that Frank Gehry used that built Valve came from the Soviet Union, actually from the Magnitogorsk area where most titanium comes from, and only did so because it was at the moment when the bids were out there, Soviet Union, or the former Soviet Union, dumped on the market a whole quantity of it, and they were able to buy it up. At that point, the material was partly milled in Pittsburgh. There were Italian and Spanish contracts. I mean, the web in which we live is so complex. The process of production is so complicated. And yet we continue to divorce consumption from production. We have amnesia, lobotomy about what takes place before the photographer gets in there and photographs the building and hits the magazines. Everything that preceded is either in the architect's very deep in the computer or somewhere else. I think all that needs to be back together again, and I do believe that in a world that is more and more citified, more and more urban, architects have more to do. They have more responsibility and also more work. So great, as far as that's concerned. In terms of power, I'd like to make the argument that architecture can be, it is a kind of heterotopia, it's this kind of other place that is got its own sort of can be a realm of difference with respect to the rest of the world, and yet all that embeddedness in reality, what the client will tolerate, what the budget will permit, really cramps the style. I mean, it's not Jackson Pollock standing, in the studio and throwing paint on the floor. It's another process entirely, and it has its powerful constraints.
In this complex world that Joan and Reinhold are talking about, I think one of the things that is necessary is that the architect have more expertise in his or her discipline than he has ever or she has ever had. That requires a lot of time to study. All doctors are not out goes to Bernard's point, curing malaria in Africa. They're working on laboratory projects that ultimately will help the world. I would argue that architecture also has those same kinds of laboratory projects that may not be on the front line as we understand it. To conclude, I will give you two Tafuri stories, personal Tafuri stories, for any of you young architects who feel like revolutionaries. One is that in 1980, Portuguese was having a biennale called La Strada Novissima, which was a biennale of the high point of postmodern historicism. I was asked by the American curator of that exhibition, Robert A.M. Stern, to join that particular Strada Novissima. When Manfredo Tafuri heard about it, he called me and said, "Peter, you cannot go into that. You have to make a political gesture and not go into this exhibition." I listened to Tafuri. It was a big mistake. Number two, Tafuri not going in. Not going in. Everybody else went in. I'm ending with this.
I'm just imagining the facade. I'm trying to.
Anyway, don't not go in. And to follow that up, Tafuri said, "You know something, Peter, about you? All of your ideas and your wonderful ideas will be for nothing if you don't build. None of us who are historians are concerned with architects who don't have a trace of something on the ground. You better build or your ideas will be worthless."
Okay. It's a new one though. I haven't heard the one about the not being told yet. Part one of that one the other day, a couple years ago.
Sorry.
Okay. Different audience. Yeah, it is. So to be very, very. I began with by evoking a small Soviet era line, and I'll just end maybe to continue because I was meeting with Bernard. I was trying to just say something quickly about cities. If I hear one more time that half the world's population now lives in cities, I'm going to walk out of the room. I would suggest you do the same. Or at least raise your hand and ask, yes, but what about the other half? Or is that all? Or so what? And in other words, what the new attraction to the city that our colleague Michon so eloquently articulates has something behind it. That something I think we all know ultimately what it is, and it doesn't necessarily merely do damage. I mean, it's the ground. The real estate industry that now wants to build more densely populated cities for the high bourgeois of the 21st century, and allow those who don't live in cities to live in ever deeper squalor. that also, yes, it's green, and it naturally, and there are many, many compelling arguments for cities, and I very much share those, and I spend a good deal of time making them myself. However, because I don't consider myself a dialectician, but I feel like I need to every now and then do a little bit of dialectics 101. Here, what we're dealing with is a contradiction. It's what dialectics calls a contradiction. When the real estate developer is your friend, that's a contradiction, or at least it ought to be. It ought to be recognized as such. And it's an interesting one, and it's a difficult one. And I actually would want to say more. This is what makes me not quite not quite a dialectician. It's a double bind. It's a harder one. It's like what your parents do to you, not just what the real estate developer. But that's the second one. But the point, the simple point, being that one of the legacies of the various histories that has been summoned to the table here is precisely a sensitivity to those kinds of contradictions, and that's a very good place to start for anybody if you want to consider possible futures, is to recognize and come to terms with those difficulties rather than looking for ways to wish them away.
I'm not going out further. I just need to respond to something Reinhold said. He was directed to what I was saying, because I gave a statistic. I didn't do 20.
Oh, did you do it? No, you didn't do it. I didn't hear it.
50, and 70% of the world's going to be urbanized. But all I was trying to suggest by that Reinhold is that architects don't know much about agriculture, right? And they don't know too much about, under marine biology. They are trained to know something about built environments, which, and I'm living in suburbia. I'm not distinguishing between urban and suburban either. But I'm just saying that architects have more.
Sure, yeah. I wasn't disagreeing with you. I was talking about the English with Sean. I didn't even know what you said. You did?
Yeah.
Sorry.
As the whatever order makes it, I'll be the last to comment. I think once upon a time there were many more of those discussions on architecture and politics. And they had a lot in common with what we have tonight. And in other words, a very difficult, great difficulty to focus on the theme of the evening. And maybe it is because that's the nature of architecture itself. It's both, as we say, intrinsic and extrinsic. It's both has to do with things which have nothing to do with architecture per se. In other words, the environment, the developer, the noise, whatever, the regulations. And things which are deeply embedded into what architecture is, which is quite fascinating because some of us are still trying after several thousand years to keep defining what architecture is. So this, and it's not quite a dialectic, but it's certainly an opposition. I would simply say that as a theorist, or as someone who works on your own, you are only responsible to your theory. As a practitioner, you're responsible for a lot of other things. So you just work it out.